discussion here. I guess I was just curious why you're only repealing the dairy provision of the permanent law and not the entire permanent law. I guess, is there some reason for that?
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Certainly. The reason for that is because the milk price support is actually a floor for the cost that the government buys surplus milk. And what that will do is it will raise the cost that the government's going to have to pay for this surplus milk. Thus, it's going to cost the taxpayers more money.
Well, gentlemen,
are you back?
Well, I mean, what it does is it sets the price of dairy at 85% of parity, and that would have been about $39. But it also sets the price of wheat and corn and soybeans at anywhere from, I don't know, it's 80 to 95% of parity. And it sets, you know, those prices are just as problematic. The difference is, you know, what happened last December, you know, the law expired on September 30th, but nothing actually happens till that current year crop is harvested. Well, wheat is not harvested till May, corn isn't harvested till, you know, October, November, but milk is harvested every day. That's why it became an issue. So I'm against getting rid of the permanent law, but I was just curious why you picked on just dairy. I mean, I see your point that you're going to raise costs to the government, but if you want to really raise costs to the government, support the Goodlatte-Scott amendment, because that's really going to stick it to the government, you know. So I just, you know, wanted to...
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself simply the time remaining. I think my colleagues are having a good faith discussion. I do appreciate the point that the ranking member brings. If we're going to address one part of the 49 Act, we probably should address all of it. There's been ongoing discussions as long as I've been here about how to do that. Many provisions of federal law have an underlying base law, and we do laws then that build off of that, and when they expire, you revert to permanent law. That's the case of the 49 law. Maybe the 2013 Farm Bill should become the permanent law to give us at least a realistic, modern thing to come from. But that's probably a discussion for a different amendment, and I would say quite simply, I respect my colleague, but I too cannot vote to piecemeal undo things. I've got to have a systematic way about it. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
And how much time do I have left?
Gentleman from Georgia has 2.5 minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, from the comments that my good friend from Minnesota and my good friend from Oklahoma stated, maybe we should repeal the whole 49 law. And I would be all in favor of working with both gentlemen to try to find some way to do that. And I'm sure both gentlemen would be very eager to not have the incentive to go back to that law as a piecemeal way of trying to deal with these problems. And my friend from Minnesota is exactly right. The difference between crops. I used to farm. I've been a dairy farmer. I had Holstein cows. I was a true farmer. I've raised feeder steers. I've hay farmed. I've truck farmed, and I've row cropped. And I know agriculture. I wasn't a gentleman farmer. I'd climb in the back of a combine to clean out the stops and change the harrogating. So I know agriculture, and I know the biggest problem agriculture faces today is the regulation, particularly from EPA. And I'd like to see those regulations roll back because that would help our agriculture more than any other thing that we could do. And I would be all in favor of doing that. But the reason I brought the milk part of the old law forward was because of exactly what my good friend from Minnesota stated. You have to milk cows not once a day, but at least twice a day, sometimes 3. And the milk support price that is guaranteed in this underlying law will raise cost if we go back to that and it stays in place. And if we don't have it suspended or reauthorized, the Farm Bill, then what happens is the federal government is going to pay much higher prices for milk, and that's going to increase the cost in the grocery store for all Americans, and it's going to hurt the poor people, particularly poor children and senior citizens. If I have any time left, how much time do I have left, sir?
Gentleman has 20 seconds remaining.
I'll be glad to.
I don't know if we have time, but just the point, I agree with, I understand what you're saying, but you need to look at the Goodlatte-Scott amendment, because what it does is it allows them to buy insurance as $18 a hundredweight, and if the price goes to 11 bucks like it did in '09, the taxpayers are on the hook. So you've got the same problem going on with what Goodlatte-Scott are trying to do to this bill that you're talking about here. So I hope you look at that.
Time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
gentleman from Georgia. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment Number 6, printed in House Report Number 113-117, offered by Mr. Enyart of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Enyart, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to myself so much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to offer an amendment to this bill to help agriculture in southern Illinois, in my state, Illinois, and indeed in the entire nation the next time drought strikes. After Hurricane Sandy, the drought of 2012 was the second most costly natural disaster in the world. The drought cost upwards of $35 billion in total losses. It devastated southern Illinois crops and crops throughout the Midwest. The fact that there is no national response or preparedness plan for drought increases these costs by at least 25%. Indeed, FEMA is not even authorized to address drought, even when areas are declared natural disasters due to drought. In the 110th Congress, my colleague from Florida, Congressman Alcee Hastings, authored legislation to establish a National Drought Council. I applaud his foresight and his work, which was included in the House version of the Farm Bill. Unfortunately, House and Senate conferees failed to include it in the final bill. Had it been included, perhaps the federal response to last year's drought would have been streamlined and devastating losses mitigated. My amendment, which is based on Congressman Hastings' work, would give the Secretary of Agriculture an important tool to help our farmers more quickly. The Council would be tasked to develop a comprehensive national drought action plan that defines responsibilities for drought preparedness, mitigation, research, risk management, training, and emergency relief programs. The plan provides guidance to federal agencies to ensure their activities are coordinated with the activities of states, local governments, Indian tribes, and neighboring countries. Through an annual report to Congress, the Council will make recommendations to eliminate duplication and to establish common interagency triggers to authorize federal drought programs. Based on a review of drought preparedness plans, the Council will develop and make available to the public drought planning models. What this appointed Council would not do is draw a paycheck, establish a new office, or increase the federal bureaucracy. It's not a question of will a drought strike, it's a question of when. When it does, we need to be better prepared. I urge adoption of this amendment and ask the support of my colleagues. I yield back, sir. I'm sorry, I yield to the chairman. I yield to the chairman.
Gentleman yields to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I simply want to note, being Oklahoman, I have an appreciation for drought issues, and I thank the gentleman for bringing this important topic to his attention. I think we should all vote for the gentleman's amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Gentleman yields
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment Number 7, printed in House Report Number 113-117, offered by Mr. Graves of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Graves, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I bring Amendment Number 7 to the consideration of the House here as we debate this very important issue. And when I think about the issue that's before us, and I know there are a lot of good members on both sides of it, for and against, and there's going to be a lot of great debate about whether or not this bill should move forward in any fashion or another. But there's one particular portion that I really wanted to discuss today, and it deals with the incentives and the benefits that go to corn producers for the production of corn that goes to ethanol. And to me, I don't believe that is something that should be provided to these producers whatsoever, these incentives or benefits. In fact, when the bill was originally crafted many, many years ago, back in 1933, I have to ask, did the original architects of the Farm Bill ever imagine that what they were creating at that time would go to benefit the producers of corn that would go to fuel and not food? So my amendment's rather simple. It just eliminates the opportunity for any producer to benefit from producing corn that would go to fuel, and instead focuses back on what the original intent of the legislation was, and that was to exclusively be for the food production or feed production. So as we debate this bill, and as folks are going to be on all different sides of all these amendments, I think it's really important at least get back to the original intent. If you're going to support the bill, get back to the original intent of what was intended back in 1933 and the years since then. But let me just remind the House that this is why it's so important, because estimates tell us that more than 1/3 of all our corn in the United States is used for feed livestock. Another 13% is exported, mostly for feed livestock, but another 40% of all corn produced in this nation is for ethanol. And all of that, nearly half of all corn in our nation that's produced, those producers receive those same benefits that those that were intending to create corn for food and feed would benefit from as well. So, Mr. Chairman, my amendment's rather simple, and I would urge the House consideration of this amendment.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim a rise to claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself as much time as I might use.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would note to my colleague, I appreciate his issue of concern. I appreciate, I think, what he's trying to do. But in the nature of the Farm Bill and the nature of the debate we're at right now, this is not really the environment, and I would ask him to consider withdrawing his amendment in good faith for a discussion sometime in the near future. And with that, I would yield to my colleague from Georgia.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I thank you for your good work on this, and I know we've all had a lot of discussions, and I'll take you for your word on your word that we can continue this conversation because I think it's a very important topic, and with your intent, and I know it to be true that we can continue this, I would be willing to withdraw the amendment and continue the debate at a further time.
Reclaiming my time, I thank the gentleman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yields back the balance of his time.
I believe the gentleman from Arkansas would like to take, was it, gentleman? Okay. My intention, Mr. Chairman, therefore, would be to withdraw the amendment, but let me just close with this and say that as we debate the various policies within this bill, it is very important to note that there are areas such as this in which I hear the other side talk about the importance of food being provided for our citizens all across the country, and I don't disagree with them at all. I think that's very important. So therefore, why would we, as a House, stand to incentivize those who are producing nearly half of the corn that could be going to the food supply of our great nation, but incentivize half the corn almost in our nation rather for fuel instead of food. And I look forward to continuing this debate. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time and ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back the balance of his time. The amendment is withdrawn.
Thank you.
It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 8, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment Number 8, printed in House Report Number 113-117, offered by Mr. Blumenauer of Oregon.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Conservation Reserve Program has sparked major improvements in water quality, wildlife habitat, and wetlands. However, high crop and land prices are spurring landowners to once again pull millions of valuable, vulnerable acres back under the plow as their CRP leases expire. In the last 10 years, we've seen a number of acres equal to the area of the state of Indiana taken out of the Conservation Reserve Program and put back into production. This means that the CRP's environmental benefits are not well leveraged, and taxpayers' dollars don't earn the return they should because they've spent 5 years protecting land simply to have it disappear at the end of the easement period. This amendment makes a set of simple, revenue-neutral changes to be made to the CRP to provide more lasting protection of water, wildlife, and soil, and to make sure we are fully leveraging federal spending. It requires, to the extent possible, 20% of the funds dedicated to the Conservation Reserve Program to be used in the Continuous Conservation Reserve, the CCRP, and the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, CREP. These programs are subset of the Conservation Reserve programs and help leverage state matching funds to produce even greater conservation benefits. In particular, the CREP program gives states flexibility to target high-priority conservation and environmentally sensitive areas, which helps coordinate federal and local priorities and spending and ensures that any spending is targeted to produce the best results. The Continuous Conservation Reserve Program is a program that is consistently oversubscribed, that helps farmers re-enroll in the program continuously rather than just once a year. Adding acreage to this program gives farmers more flexibility. It also protects the long-term conservation benefits of the CRP program so that taxpayers get what they pay for. These small changes are revenue neutral and will help CRP produce better outcomes for the environment and for taxpayers, leverage state matching funds, and provide long-term stability for farmers. I respectfully ask that my colleagues join me in supporting this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Oregon reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I will use whatever time I may consume. H.R. 1947 will step down the acreage cap of the CRP program from 32 million acres to 24 million acres. Designated in law the required amount of acres for sub-programs of CRP will reduce the FSA's flexibility in administering the program. I do understand that the set-aside in the amendment is consistent with how FSA is currently runs the program. However, when crafting the conservation title, we tried to leave as much flexibility as possible. I fear the set-aside could limit future general sign-ups or tie FSA's hands in future targeted initiatives. I'll work with the gentleman to ensure that CRP targets the most environmentally sensitive lands, but I must urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Preserve the balance of my time.
No,
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Oregon reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to yield the remainder of my time to the ranking member from Minnesota, Mr. Peterson.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank the Chairman. And, you know, I want to assure Mr. Blumenauer that the Chairman and I share his concerns and philosophy, and but this is not, in my judgment, an amendment that's necessary, because there has never been a situation that I'm aware of where the continuous sign-up has been limited by anything going on. In fact, they can't get enough continuous acres signed up to meet the goals that they've had. The same thing with the CREP acres. So the department has administratively always made room for any continuous and any CREP requests that are out there. There's never been a limitation, there's never been a backlog, there's never been any impediment to signing up these acres. The issue we have now with CRP is these high land prices and high commodity prices. You're right about that. And we are seeing acres come out, you know, all over the country, and that concerns me. I've been the biggest champion of CRP, and I reluctantly agreed to lower these acres to 24 million acres because that's what's going to happen anyway. These acres are going to be reduced, but it's not going to be in continuous, and it's not going to be in CREP. It's going to be in the regular CRP program. And if I could figure out how to stop that, I would, but you'd have to literally triple or quadruple the amount of money that's paid for the general sign-up in order to get those acres back into the program, given my understanding of what's going on. So, you know, I just don't see why we need to have this in there. You know, we've always accommodated this, and if we're going to do anything in CRP, what we should be doing is figuring out how we can raise the rental rates to get the general CRP sign-up back up to where it needs to be. And I'm very concerned about losing this big tract CRP, because this is what's brought wildlife around the country back, and you know, we're losing it. So the last thing I would say about this is that you know, I lost my train of thought, but anyway, you know, there is not a impediment to continuous or CREP, and there won't be in the future. And if there's anything left over that isn't up to the 24 million acres, it's going to be out of the general sign-up. It isn't going to be out of CREP or continuous. So I oppose the amendment. I don't think there's any reason to do this, because the department has been taking care of it.
Gentleman from Minnesota yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
How much time do I have remaining?
Gentleman from Oregon has 2.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you. The purpose of the amendment is to help focus on more long-lasting protection for the water, wildlife, and soil. I appreciate what the ranking member said in terms of issues for additional funding for wildlife habitat, and I have another amendment coming forward which I think helps address that. In the meantime, having an opportunity here and I mentioned in the amendment, is to the extent possible, the 20% dedicated for the Continuous Reserve Program and the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. Being able to focus and leverage the local funds seems to me to provide long-term stability, leverage the state matching. And I see my colleague from Virginia is here. I don't know if he wants to speak on the next one. I respectfully request that members join with me in an amendment that is supported by the Environmental Working Group, the National Sustainable Agricultural Coalition, Defenders of Wildlife, Pew Trusts, Organic Trade Association, Slow Food, Food Democracy, the Organic Consumers Union, and Union of Concerned Scientists. Allowing us to be able to move forward in this regard, I think, would be a positive. I didn't hear any compelling reasons from my friends other than they thought it would be taken care of. I think this amendment will assure that it will move forward, and respectfully ask for its approval.
Gentleman from Oregon yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, that I would request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 9, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment Number 9, printed in House Report Number 113-117, offered by Mr. Blumenauer of Oregon.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
I yield myself 2.5 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
I appreciate the Rules Committee having made this amendment in order. It makes important revenue-neutral changes to the EQIP program to protect the original intent of the program, to use tax dollars better to help more farmers and produce better results for the taxpayers. In difficult budget times, we must prioritize maximizing value and saving money. This amendment makes several changes to the Environmental Quality Incentives Program to restore the 1996 language. It implements stricter payment limits to make sure we're not spending too much money on any one project. And at a time when demand for conservation funding is as much as 4 times greater than the supply, we can't afford to let a few huge projects crowd out available funding. This amendment also reinstates the original 1996 EQIP language, which eliminated spending for factory farms. That language was included in 1996 because members were nervous that too much of the EQIP would end up going to just a few family farm projects, and they were right. The legislation also provides additional support for farmers who want to transition to production techniques that use fewer pesticides or antibiotics. As the United States doctors and scientists become increasingly concerned about the use of non-therapeutic antibiotics in meat production, we should be doing everything we can to make it easier for farmers and ranchers to reduce their dependence on antibiotics. Finally, it clarifies that EQIP is intended to be used as a short-term program and protects wildlife habitat incentive program set-aside, which has been in place since the program began. The opposition comes from those who are using conservation dollars for purposes that most Americans would not consider to be conservation related. Recent data shows that 1 in 4 EQIP dollars in the last 10 years has been spent on large structural projects that produce limited conservation benefits and are extremely expensive. I noted in the press this last week one project almost $2 million. Yet the average is about $13,500. I appreciate the opportunity to start this discussion and think about how best to spend limited conservation dollars for maximum conservation benefits. I respectfully suggest that that's to be found with this amendment, and I urge its adoption, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's 2.5 minutes expires. His time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield myself as much time as I might consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. The conservation title has gone through many reforms by combining, eliminating duplicative programs. The result, I believe, is a fair, balanced, and flexible conservation title that addresses the natural resource concerns of farmers, ranchers, and landowners. However, the gentleman's amendment seeks to undo this balance by stripping the EPA program of the authorities that make it unique. EQIP program is arguably the most successful conservation program administered by the NRCS. Through cost-share assistance, these programs help farmers and ranchers meet and exceed national, state, and local environmental regulations. Known as the bricks and mortar of the program, farmers and ranchers depend on EQIP for assistance to build waste storage facilities, eliminate nutrient runoff, purchase equipment like methane digesters. The gentleman's amendment would fundamentally change EQIP with arbitrary limits that would reduce livestock producers' participation and restrict the types of conservation programs that could be implemented. With EPA and environmental groups targeting livestock operations, we should not diminish the program's current authorities. The amendment would make EPA no different than any other working lands program and eliminate an essential tool that farmers and ranchers depend on to meet increasing environmental regulations. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment and reserve the balance of my time. Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Oklahoma reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I would yield 75 seconds to my friend from Virginia, Mr. Moran.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute and 1/4. Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment because it would improve the Environmental Quality Incentives Program by targeting support for the smaller and mid-sized farms where the investment will buy a bigger bang for the buck. Just 1% of agribusinesses get more than 20% of EQIP payments, and about 70% of that funding is used to build structures to store manure and lay irrigation pipeline, purchase sprinkler systems and other equipment. This amendment doesn't do anything to prohibit or restrict large farming operations. In fact, the limits in this amendment would have impacted less than 0.5% of all EQIP contracts between 1997 and 2010, where we have statistics. Our limited federal funding, I think, would be better targeted by helping small and mid-sized farms engage in more sustainable practices, such as transitioning to farming methods that use fewer antibiotics and pesticides. I think it makes sense to target where we can get the biggest bang for the buck, because more intensive production practices, if not properly managed and mitigated, contaminate our drinking water, pollute the air, and diminish the quality of the soil, placing future production yields at risk. And it seems to me in austere budget times we ought not cut or do away with conservation incentives, but instead make them more efficient, and that's what the gentleman's amendment would do. So I rise in support of it. I think it's a good amendment that helps small and medium-sized farms. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time to the ranking member of the House Agriculture Committee, Mr. Peterson.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 3½ minutes.
I thank the gentleman, and I rise in opposition to the amendment. Not that I disagree with the intent here, and I think that if you look at the EQIP program, you will see that it has primarily been utilized by smaller producers around the country. But I just want to give you the example of the real world here of how this works in my district. We have the Sauk River in my district, which is a beautiful river that has probably 100 dairy farms located alongside this river. These dairy farms have been there for 75, 100 years. These have been in the family. A lot of these farms are 50 cows, 75 cows, probably 100 cows would be the largest one. So these are small family farms, have been in their families for generations. And the problem is that the barns and the pastures and the barnyards were located next to the river, all along this river. That's just how they did things 75 years ago. And so we have used, and so what happened is that river got polluted from the manure running off, and the Sauk Lake, which is a beautiful lake, became over-fertilized, and it grew up with weeds and so forth, and you've seen that in the Chesapeake Bay and so forth. Well, what we did is we went in there with the EQIP money and moved these barnyards and moved these cattle out away from the river. And, we didn't build any huge structures or anything. We built some to try to dam up things and so forth. But the point is that even with the limitations that we had on there of the 300,000, we still had to, this was not a cheap thing to do on these farms, and these weren't big farms. So it took us, 2, 3, 4 years to move each of these operations, and to move 100 of them, took us, 20, 25 years. But we have basically accomplished that, and we've cleaned up the river, cleaned up the lake, and if you had this amendment, we'd never be able to get that done. We wouldn't have the 30,000 a year would not get us anywhere near where we needed to do to get that, get that accomplished in that area. Now, that's just one example. So the NRCS people and the FSA people that are involved in this, they monitor these things. They're, kind of prioritizing where they go. And you can see from when you look at the statistics you know, they've been focused on the smaller projects. But there are times when you have to deal with things that have been put out there, not because of anybody doing anything with any ill intent. It's just what they did 100 years ago, and we're trying to clean it up. So I would caution the members to be careful about putting any limitations on these programs, because a lot of times it can have a consequence that wasn't intended. So I oppose this amendment and would urge my colleagues to do the same. And gentlemen, should I yield back?
Gentleman from Minnesota yields
back
back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
And I have 75 seconds.
1 1/4 minutes.
I would recognize the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 45 seconds.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 45 seconds.
I support this amendment. We've seen natural disasters from droughts to heat waves to floods affecting farmers from coast to coast because of the climate change issue. We spend billions of dollars on crop insurance subsidies to cover the costs of these climate disasters. This amendment expands and improves the USDA Environmental Quality Incentives Program to bring support to farmers to adjust to a changing climate. It adds climate mitigation as an eligible EQIP program expense. I think it makes sense, and I would urge my colleagues to support it.
Gentleman from California yields back. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you. And I appreciate my friends joining me. The crux of this issue is who's going to get the benefit. There were over 300,000 contracts. 92 projects took 20% of the money. This amendment would target it for those, a far greater number. Most of the large confined animal feedlot operations manage on their own. The rest of them can. Focus it for people who need it the most, not have a bunch of the money sucked up by large industrial agricultural activities. Provide more benefit for more farmers and ranchers. Approve this amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman,
from Oregon is recognized.
on that I would request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 10, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment Number 10, printed in House Report Number 113-117, offered by Mr. Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. For many years, local farmers in New Mexico have been asking for an amendment that would allow local acequia and community ditch associations to access EQIP funds. An acequia is a centuries-old irrigation structure that is still in use today in primarily Hispanic communities across New Mexico and is governed by a small board made up of private landowners. The Board of Private Landowners, also called the Acequia and Community Ditch Association, is in charge of administering maintenance of the irrigation infrastructure, which often requires work on sections of the infrastructure residing on private land. Because of the current EQIP rules, individual producers can apply for assistance under the program, but are not allowed to include the Community Ditch Association to help with the work, even though the Community Ditch Association is charged with maintaining the infrastructure for all water users. Mr. Chairman, you can see the dilemma that we're facing in New Mexico. This translates into burdensome roadblocks to improve conservation practices or manage scarce water resources. Mr. Chairman, in New Mexico, we're seeing one of the worst droughts in our history, and improving water use and conservation practices are key to keeping our agricultural communities alive. The Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, charged with administering the EQIP program, has indicated this language in my amendment would create the administrative efficiency needed when working with small producers in New Mexico who irrigate their crops via acequia and community ditches. This amendment does not open up the program to large irrigation districts or government entities, but simply affords local Hispanic farmers in rural New Mexico equal eligibility to compete for funding. Acequia and community ditch associations, which are comprised solely of private landowners, do not have the authority to impose taxes or levies, are in need of this clarifying language. Mr. Chairman, these programs are put together state by state and funded state by state, and it's my hope that through the work with the committee staff, and Mr. Chairman, the minority staff and the majority staff, I really want to thank them because they really took the time with my team to take a look at this, and I think everyone understands the need, although there still may be some questions. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the balance of my time. I will yield. Yes, sir.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
The chair would just note to the gentleman that I think he's got a very interesting concept here. Clearly, we need to talk a little more about this as we go along, but if my ranking member would nod his head over there, I certainly would be willing to accept this amendment.
Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I thank everyone for their help on this.
Gentleman from New Mexico yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Mexico. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 11, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. It is now in order to consider amendment number 12, printed in Part B of House Report 113-17. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I seek recognition to offer an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, amendment number 12, printed in House Report number 113-117, offered by Mr. Gardner of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to be here, and thank the chairman of the Ag Committee for his leadership on this amendment, and also Congressman Jared Polis from Colorado. We've worked together on this Emergency Watershed Protection Program. Over the past couple of years, we've seen incredible wildfires ravage the West in New Mexico, in Colorado, in Wyoming, in Montana, in the Northwest. Millions of acres have been lost. Just this past month alone, over 500 homes have been lost in Colorado in the Black Forest Fire. And we know one thing occurs as a result of wildfires. And it's not just the event that occurs during the fire, it's not just the impact of the burning itself to the fire to the homes, but it's what happens in the days, months, and years following a forest fire that leads to millions of dollars worth of damage from a single incident. In the case of the High Park fire last year, in the case of the Waldo Canyon fire last year, and indeed in the case of the Black Forest fire coming up in the coming weeks. We know that when there is moisture, when there's rain, when there's snow, erosion will occur. I'm holding a vial of sediment from a river. It looks like dirt, it's black, but it actually came from a river after a forest fire in Colorado. Millions of dollars of damage done to the ecosystem as a result of a fire, making runoff, destroy transportation systems, clog culverts, and impact drinking water systems. The Emergency Watershed Protection Program has been a critical program that helps communities prepare for and mitigate damage from natural disaster. As wildfires continue to hit the western United States, this program will continue to do great good. Last year was an unusually devastating year for wildfires in the United States. Across the country, 67,000 wildfires burned over 9 million acres. Significant wildfires occurred in almost every state in the nation. Our amendment today is simple. It requires the Secretary of Agriculture to give priority consideration for the use of the Emergency Watershed Protection funding for projects that prevent and mitigate the impacts of catastrophic wildfires. It does not prevent Emergency Watershed Protection Program funding from being used for other types of disasters, but the EWP program has aided countless communities to protect public safety in the wake of the West's most destructive wildfires. Before a wildfire, the Emergency Watershed Protection Program helps communities mitigate future wildfire damage by protecting critical watersheds. After a wildfire, EWP helps communities stabilize burn slopes to protect drinking water infrastructure and prevent erosion and minimize potential hazards that cause immediate threats to people and property. The amendment is supported by the entire Colorado House delegation, and I thank Congressman Polis for his support and work on this amendment, and I urge a yes vote.
Gentleman from Colorado reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim the time in opposition.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes.
And with that, I would like to yield to the gentleman from Mississippi 4 3/4 minutes.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized for 4 3/4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. While I'm not in opposition to the proposed amendment, I do have an amendment that I had planned to offer, and however, the process was going so fast and I was not here in the time, but it speaks to the Wetland Reserve Program at USDA, commonly referred to as the WRP program. To date, WRP has restored over 2.5 million acres with over 12,000 private landowners. WRP benefits private landowners by restoring land that should have never been cleared for agriculture. The public benefits from the reduced financial demand for disaster assistance and or crop insurance fund from lands that experience repeated losses. Significant long-term conservation benefits obtained from the protection of wildlife habitat, the improvement of water quality, the increase of flood storage, and the reduction of soil erosion. The House Farm Bill we are considering today consolidates into a new agricultural conservation easement program. This new program will consist of agricultural easement and wetland easements. The components of amendments that I offer today are simple. First, it makes the ownership eligibility requirement for wetland easement equal to the other conservation programs by returning to the pre-2008 Farm Bill requirements of 1-year ownership instead of 7 years. My amendment's last change excludes the wettest soil from the county enrollment caps. Soil in these classes frequently flood and retain moisture at levels that severely impair or prevent farming. By allowing the lands that are the least economical to farm to be enrolled in a wetland easement, we will save the potentially public-funded disaster assistance and reduce the overall cost of crop insurance. Mr. Speaker, all of these changes would have been adopted in the Senate Farm Bill. The WRP is reshaping how wetland conservation is carried out on private lands, and in doing so in a cost-effective manner. And had I had the opportunity, I would have offered this amendment. However, after consultation with the chair and ranking member, there is agreement that I will withdraw the amendment, and we will ensure that these important changes are considered in conference.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I thank you, Chairman, and would like at this point to yield to my colleague from Colorado, Congressman Polis, for 2 minutes. Congressman Polis and I have worked closely together the past couple of years as wildfires have affected our districts. His district currently has a wildfire burning as we enter this debate right now, and would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for the remainder of your time, 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from Colorado. There's a new fire near Bailey, Colorado. In addition, just in this last week, the Black Forest Fire has already destroyed 500 homes and killed 2 Coloradans. Last year, an unusually devastating year for wildfires, where there were 67,000 wildfires across the country. Look, this emergency watershed protection program is absolutely critical for communities that are impacted by fires. That's why our entire delegation from Colorado Democrats, Republicans, led by Mr. Gardner and I, are all co-sponsors of this amendment. And I'm proud to offer this common sense amendment, which would simply require that the Secretary of Agriculture give priority consideration to emergency watershed project funding for projects that prevent and mitigate the impacts of catastrophic wildfires. Simply establishes that as a priority, and for those of us who come from communities that have been impacted, we see firsthand the need for these funds to help protect drinking water, to help prevent erosion, to minimize potential hazards that can cause additional threats to people and property long after the fires have been extinguished. Now, we know we can't stop wildfires, but we can take measures to reduce their impacts on our communities both before and after the wildfire. To be clear, this amendment doesn't prevent emergency watershed protection funding from being used for other types of disasters, and it will. It just stipulates that in the wake of severe fire emergencies, the Secretary of Agriculture will give priority to considering emergency watershed projects that impact these areas. I strongly urge my colleagues to vote yes on the Gardner, Polis, Lamborn, Kaufman, Perlmutter to get Tipton amendment. I don't think I've ever said all of our names before. I say to the gentleman from Colorado, our entire delegation standing strong behind this amendment, and I hope that we adopt Amendment 119, the Emergency Watershed Protection Amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the remaining time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the endeavor of the delegation from Colorado. I understand they're dealing with very challenging circumstances out there. I'm not necessarily sure this is the final form this language should be in, but I would suggest to my colleagues that we support them and we pass this amendment, and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. We can't do Conway, or that jump out of order? It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 13, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk, does the gentleman rise as the designee of the gentleman?
Yes.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment Number 13, printed in House Report Number 113-117, offered by Mr. Fortenberry of Nebraska.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've been pleased to work with Congressman Thompson in providing this common sense amendment to enhance the conservation goals in our country. Our farmers and ranchers are first stewards of the land, and this amendment would simply continue the practice of conservation planning on our most fragile lands to ensure that we meet important land and stewardship goals. The concept is widely upheld as an important conservation initiative by many in the agricultural and environmental communities. The amendment does call upon farmers and ranchers to develop unique conservation plans when seeking to receive federal crop insurance subsidies on highly erodible lands. I believe this to be a reasonable measure that is consistent with our current conservation policies. It is also important to emphasize that this is not a new idea. In fact, this approach has a long track record of proven results. Conservation compliance was linked with crop insurance in the 1985 Farm Bill and has been tied to direct payments since 1996. According to a report by the USDA's Economic Research Service, an estimated 295 million tons of erosion reduction per year could be directly attributed to implementation of conservation compliance policy. In addition, conservation compliance has resulted in significant reduction in the annual loss of wetlands. I believe this is a strategy that has worked. Given some late-hour complications that have arisen, I'm going to ask unanimous consent that the amendment be withdrawn, but I hope that we can look forward to continuing dialogue with the chairman, particularly since this is in the underlying Senate bill.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. It is now in order to consider amendment number 14 printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition?
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Is the gentlewoman a designee of the gentleman from Florida?
Yes, I am the designee of the gentleman from Florida.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, amendment number 14, printed in House Report number 113-117, offered by Ms. Capter of Ohio.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentlewoman from Ohio, Mrs. Capter, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I rise to offer amendment number 14 as it appears in the report on behalf of Congressman Hastings, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
First, I would like to offer my highest commendation to Congressman Hastings for his work on this vital issue. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to insert Mr. Hastings' statement into the record on this amendment.
Request will be covered by general leave.
Let me begin with the words of Congressman Hastings: no bees, no food. The amendment being offered today will help coordinate the federal response to the sudden, massive, and frightening decline in our nation's bee population. Specifically, the amendment would allow the Secretary of Agriculture to work with the Secretary of Interior and Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to ensure the long-term viability of our bee populations. The amendment would allow the establishment of a task force on bee health and commercial beekeeping to coordinate federal efforts in addressing the significant bee population decline. Preliminary results from a survey by the U.S. Department of Agriculture show that nearly a third of managed honeybee colonies in our country were lost during the 2012-2013 winter. That is an increase of 42% in honeybee losses. On average, U.S. beekeepers lost nearly half of their colonies during this past winter. This was an increase nationally of over 78% from the previous winter. Traditionally, the average loss had only been about 10 to 15%, and there have been significant honeybee losses in 22 different states. This amendment will help coordinate the federal response to the sudden massive decline of our nation's bee population. Since 2006, we have lost 10 million beehives, costing beekeepers more than $2 billion. No one knows what is causing these dramatic losses, which is formally referred to as colony collapse disorder. We don't know if it is a natural phenomenon. We don't know if it's the result of changes in the environment. We don't know if it's due to interactions with genetically modified crops. We don't know if it is due to pesticides. I can tell you one thing it's due to, because I've seen it myself in Ohio. It's due to mites that got in here and got into these hives on material that came in from foreign countries, from China, from South Africa by way of Brazil, varroa mites among them, and they are just crippling these colonies that have pollinated our orchards, our fields for generations. We need to take this seriously because the massive decline in these populations threatens us all. Without sufficient bee pollination, we will not be able to meet the demands of U.S. agricultural crops that require pollination to grow. It isn't by magic that all this happens. Not every plant is a self-pollinator. That means if we do not have proper bee pollination, we will not be able to grow the food we need to feed our country. And we're already importing too much food, food that could be grown here at home. The decline in the bee population has been occurring over a period of time. But listen to these losses. In 1947, when America only had about 146 million people, we had 6 million bee colonies. In 1970, that number dropped to 4 million. And in 1990, the number fell to 3 million. Today, there are only 2.5 million bee colonies in our country, and we have a population of 310 million, and it's projected by 2050 we will have a population of 500 million people. Bee health is vitally important for our food system, and bee pollination helps produce about a third of what we eat. 1/3. This adds $125 billion in global agricultural production value and $20 to $30 billion in United States agricultural production value. Of the 100 crops that provide 90% of the world's food, over 70% are pollinated by bees. Are we listening? Of the 100 crops that provide 90% of the world's food, over 70 are pollinated by bees. In North America, honeybees pollinate nearly 95 different kinds of fruits, including many specialty crops like almonds, avocados, cranberries, oranges, apples, and the current federal response to this problem is entirely inadequate. People are somnambulant. They think this is non-existent because, you know, the bee is so small it can fly right by you and you don't even see it. Most people don't know the difference between a honeybee and a bumblebee. Well, let me tell you, there's a big difference. It is so bad that one professor was quoted as saying, "We are one poor weather event or high winter bee loss away from a pollination disaster." Why have we let it get to this point where one bad storm could essentially wipe out our bee population? It is clear what we are doing is not working. This amendment is supported.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I